You are no longer needed here. That's what he said. No warning. No explanation. Just 14 words that erased 13 years of my life. I stood there, across the glass table, the morning sun slicing through the blinds like a spotlight on my humiliation. Mason Griggs didn't blink. Didn't even look me in the eye. He read from a printed page like he was reciting inventory. You are no longer needed here, Alexis. My name. Stapled to a termination. No HR rep. No buffer. Just him. The new COO. Pressed suit, cold tone, and a security officer in the corner pretending not to listen. Inside, something cracked. But it didn't sound like glass. It sounded like a system rebooting. I didn't ask. Why? Because I already knew. This wasn't about performance. Wasn't about cuts. It was about control. They wanted the system, but not the woman who built it. Not the hands that wrote its bones. Not the mind that kept 9 logistics centers pulsing across the country. They wanted the results, not the legacy. The code, not the conscience. And here's what they didn't know. That sentence, those exact 14 words. They triggered something. Something they thought no longer existed. Something I buried. Deep. Not just in myself, but inside Lyra. The system I spent over a decade building. Named after the little girl I couldn't save. They thought they were flipping a switch. What they really did was pull a wire they didn't know was live. If someone erased everything you built with just one sentence, would you walk away? Or make sure they remembered your name? If you've ever had your worth questioned, your work dismissed, or your voice silenced, share your story in the comments. Someone else might need to hear it. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just nodded, picked up the envelope, and left. But the moment the elevator doors closed, my hands were steady, and my memory was sharper than ever. They thought I was gone. They thought I'd go quietly. They had no idea. The system was still listening. And so was I. It started with a single delay. Just a hiccup in Denver's routing dashboard, nothing big. A timestamp out of sync by a few milliseconds. On paper, it was harmless. To anyone else, it would have looked like noise. A tech quirk, a lag, a shrug. But I built that system. I designed how Lyra breathes, how it blinks, how it whispers when something's off. And this wasn't normal. The field that failed was tied to emergency confirmation logic used for rerouting high-priority shipments under real-time constraints. There was no reason it should have failed. Not unless something underneath had shifted. I leaned in, checked the logs, expected a network dip, maybe a temp overload. But instead, I saw fingerprints, code edits, minor, subtle, but not mine. Someone had rewritten a clause inside the synchronization protocol. Nothing flashy, just a shift in packet verification timing. Except that clause? I remembered writing it at 2 a.m., during the early build of Lyra, after a cold front shut down 200 miles of Midwest highway. That line of logic had saved 6 deliveries from collapsing that night. It wasn't code. It was memory. And now it had been touched. I froze. This wasn't just some junior dev cleaning up old logic. This was deliberate. Someone had backend, access real backend, and they'd modified a core clause without running it through redundancy validation. Who even had that level of clearance now? Not many. And definitely not without my signature. I pulled up the version history. There it was. Edit pushed 2 days ago. Remote access. Flagged under a system account I didn't recognize. Ming, admin, root. The initials stopped me cold. Mason Griggs. It wasn't proof. Not yet. But it was the first real thread. One that led somewhere I didn't want to go. My gut clenched. I double-checked the origin IP. West Coast server cluster. An admin module that was previously disabled had been re-enabled quietly and only for 5 minutes. Just long enough to make one change. One change in one line of code. But here's the thing about systems like Lyra. They're like spider webs. Every strand is connected. Pull one, and something far away starts to tremble. I kept digging. 3 more files had been accessed that same night. All legacy files. All mine. Not deleted, just opened. Reviewed. Then closed again. It felt surgical. Not reckless. Not malicious. But strategic. And that's what scared me most. If someone was poking around in Lyra's core logic, it meant one of 2 things. Either they were trying to understand how the system worked, or they were preparing to take it apart. And if it was the second one, they had no idea what they were doing. Because Lyra wasn't just built to optimize supply chains. It was built to protect them. From weather, from conflict, from incompetence, from people. And someone had just started pulling wires. I sat back in my chair, eyes still locked on the screen. I'd seen glitches before. I'd fixed thousands. But this wasn't a glitch. This was a message. And someone had just left it in my language. Code. I didn't name the system after a constellation or some mythological figure from an overpriced tech deck. I named it after my daughter, Lyra. She lived 7 years, 4 months, and 2 days. And when she died, it wasn't from a rare disease or an incurable condition. It was from a delay. A ship meant their medication got rerouted mid-transit due to a broken logistics protocol. No one flagged the error. No one took responsibility. No one called me until it was too late. By the time the meds arrived, her fever had already spiked past the point of return. We watched her fade in a room full of sterile light and silent machines. No system failed. Not officially. But something, somewhere, didn't work fast enough. Didn't carry deep enough. That's when I made a decision. A promise, really. If I couldn't save Lyra, then I'd build something that could save someone else. Someone else's child. Someone else's father, sister, partner. A system that wouldn't just be fast, but human. One that knew what urgent really meant. That's how Lyra was born. Not as a product. Not as a platform. But as a response. A living, breathing network that I poured every ounce of grief and grit into. Emergency rerouting. Predictive allocation. Disaster failover logic. Manual escalation with facial verification for rural clinics. Time sync monitoring that could detect micro delays before they turned into missed moments. It didn't start with a business plan. It started with a funeral. And when Vanguard Freight Systems came knocking, offering me a chance to scale what I'd built, to integrate it across 8 states, and then 17, and then national, I said yes. Not for the money, but for the reach. Because the more places Lyra touched, the fewer families would have to go through what I did. And for a while, it worked. We rerouted insulin during winter storms in Montana, kept dialysis machines running during power outages in rural Idaho, rushed stem cell couriers through red zones when border protocols froze. The team didn't always understand the why, but I did. Every update I pushed carried her name. Every safeguard I wrote whispered her memory. Then came the new leadership, the IPO push, the sudden shift in tone, efficiency over empathy, speed over context, profit over protection. They stopped calling it Lyra, started calling it the Monroe system, in meetings like I was some outdated component they could replace. But Lyra was never just code. It was never just mine. It was a pact. Between a mother and a mission. That no life should ever be lost because a truck missed a turn. Because a system didn't see what mattered. Because someone higher up decided near enough was good enough. So when I saw that first alteration, that tiny change in logic they made without even understanding what it did, it wasn't just technical. It was personal. It is personal. They're not just rewriting functions. They're erasing a memory. Diluting a promise. And they have no idea what they're unraveling. Because Lyra matters. Not because it's perfect, but because it was built with pain and designed with purpose. It's not just software. It's what's left of her. And I won't let them bury that too. He didn't shake hands. Didn't smile. Didn't ask for names. The first time I saw Mason Griggs, he was standing in front of the entire infrastructure division, polished gray suit, tailored just tight enough to flex, no tie, perfect posture. His voice? Flat. Even. Rehearsed. The screen behind him read, "Scalability through simplification." He called it a vision presentation. But it felt more like a eulogy. I stood near the back of the conference room, arms crossed, watching him flick through slide after slide like he was speeding through someone else's legacy. Margins. Throughput. Profit per hour. Not unseated, he mentioned the human cost of logistics. The lives depending on those shipments. The rural clinics with no backup generators. The kids waiting on asthma meds while storms closed highways. None of that made it onto the screen. Just bar graphs and buzzwords. When someone raised a hand to ask about regional variations in emergency response latency, dismissed it. Literally. Said, "We'll address anomalies once the baseline is automated." That's how he said it. Anomalies. Like people were glitches. I knew then. He wasn't here to lead. He was here to clear space. To make the numbers prettier. For the IPO. A week later, I got summoned to his office. His assistant used the phrase, "quick strategic sync." And I walked in expecting maybe a dashboard demo or an executive alignment talk. But he didn't even bother with pleasantries. He looked up from his laptop and said, "What would it take to rebuild what you built without you?" I didn't flinch. Outwardly. But inside, I ran through 1,000 possibilities in half a second. Was this a test? A threat? A setup? I kept my voice even. "That depends," I said, "on what exactly you're trying to build." He gave a half shrug. "Theoretical. In case we ever need to restructure. Offshore, modernize, investor transparency, all that." Investor transparency. Not system resilience. Not user safety. Not medical priority logic. Just investor transparency. I told him plainly. You'd need more than a framework. You'd need context, history, embedded logic. You'd need alignment across use cases that can't be automated. He blinked slowly, then returned to his screen. Noted. That was the whole meeting. I walked out with a chill crawling down my back. It wasn't what he said. It was what he didn't ask. He never asked what Lyra does during a blizzard. Or how it reroutes shipments around political protests. He never once asked why the system was built the way it was. Because Mason Griggs didn't care how it worked. He just wanted to know how fast he could replace it. And in doing so, he answered his own question. He couldn't. Not really. Because Lyra wasn't just lines of code strung together by a tired engineer in a dark office. It was a network of decisions, made in grief and tested under fire. It was personal, precise, and dangerous, if mishandled. Mason didn't see that. He saw an old system with one name attached to too much of it. A legacy problem. And people like Mason don't erase code. They erase the people who wrote it. That day, I stopped thinking this was about strategy and started preparing for war. It happened on a Thursday. Quiet day. Cloudy sky. One of those afternoons where nothing seems urgent. Until it is. I'd stayed late to finish performance reports. The office was mostly empty, just the hum of printers and the soft click of keys echoing down polished hallways. As I passed by the shared copier room near HR, I heard it. The faint mechanical whir of a printer still working, even though no one stood nearby. Someone had forgotten to collect their stack. Normally, I would have ignored it. But something made me stop. Call it instinct. Call it muscle memory from years of double-checking what others overlook. I glanced down. Just one look. And that's all it took. Q. 4 restructuring candidates. Confidential draft. Bold letters. Company letterhead. My breath caught before I even saw the rest. But then, there it was. Monroe Alexis. First name on the list. Top of the page, highlighted in red. No explanation needed. But they gave one anyway. Legacy asset. High cost. Proprietary skill set. Risk factor if retained post-migration. And next to it, in bold type, priority, exit, tier 1. My name. As a liability. A line item on someone's efficiency roadmap. Not a person. Not a builder. Not the architect of the system they were still profiting from. Just a column to be cleared. I didn't move for a long moment. Just stood there, paper in hand, listening to the low hum of the copier finishing another pagaz if it hadn't just printed out my erasure. For 13 years, I'd bled into this company. Not metaphorically. Literally. Late nights in server rooms. Red-eye flights to get ahead of outages. Missed birthdays. Missed anniversaries. Lines of code written with shaking hands in hospital waiting rooms. And now I was a risk. A relic. Something to offboard quietly. All duh. I placed the paper back on the stack. Right where I found it. Didn't tear it. Didn't crumple it. Let them think no one saw. I walked past the elevator and took the stairs instead. Each step echoing louder than the last. Outside, the sky had started to drizzle. Fine mist settling over the parking lot like static. I looked up at the building glass and concrete, sleek and silent where Lyra still ran, humming in the background. They were still using it. Still, depending on the system I built. But me? They were already planning the clean break. That's when it hit me. This wasn't speculation. This wasn't fear. It was confirmation. Everything I'd suspected, every sideways glance, every unreturned email, every code alteration I hadn't authorized. It was all part of the same path. I wasn't being pushed aside. I was being prepared for deletion. Quietly. Efficiently. With minimal resistance. But what they didn't understand was this. I don't go quietly. Not because I'm vengeful. But because you don't get to erase the person who kept your house from collapsing in the dark. You don't red tag the woman who wrote the blueprint. Not without consequence. Not without memory. And memory, unlike corporate strategy, doesn't forget who built the foundation. I returned to the office the next morning before sunrise. No lights. No footsteps. Just the soft hum of the building stretching awake. I didn't use the main terminal. Didn't log into the dashboard like everyone else. I went deeper into the back-end interface only a handful of engineers even knew existed. The old one. The one I wrote myself. Lyra had layers. Everyone knew that. But what they didn't know, what Mason and his efficiency ops team couldn't have known, was that Lyra wasn't just code stacked in modules. It was a living lattice of logic. Built with redundancy, ethics, and intention. It didn't just operate. It protected. From bad data. From rushed deployments. From people. The deeper I went, the more I saw it. Subtle changes. Tiny alterations. A condition bypassed here. A delay introduced there. No deletions. They weren't that stupid. But they were trying to reshape the system around themselves. Quietly. Rewriting logic without triggering alerts. They were trimming the safety layers. The contingencies. The moral backbone of the code. Why? To make the system look leaner. More agile. More investor-friendly. What they didn't understand was that Lyra wasn't built to impress shareholders. It was built to endure. They called some of my code bloated. Said the legacy modules were outdated. Said the emergency rerouting protocol ran too cautiously. But, you know what cautious saved? Infants in transport during hurricane season. Insulin shipments rerouted mid-flight. Vaccine deliveries to tribal clinics with no cellular signal. That wasn't old code. That was field-tested survival logic. And they were carving it out like fat from a spreadsheet. They didn't see the full architecture. They saw lines. I saw lives. So I opened a terminal inside Laura's heartbeat where only I had root. There it was. A clause I'd written 8 years ago. Buried beneath 6 layers of authorization. A single line. It didn't look like much. Not to them. Just a log monitor, a conditional failsafe, a logic gate waiting for a match. but it had a purpose. A verbal trigger. 14 words. Spoken aloud by an executive with proper clearance. If it hurt the man didn't receive override confirmation from me within 90 minutes, it would initiate a cascade. Not a crash. Not a hack. A soft shutdown. Node by node. Country by country. Because sometimes, the only way to keep a system safe is to teach it how to say no. Not out of revenge, but out of protection. Because if they stripped out enough safety, they wouldn't just make Lyra fragile. They'd make it dangerous. And if I let them do that, without any resistance, then I wasn't just complicit. I was disposable. Just like they wanted. I stared at the string of code I'd written so long ago. Most people assumed systems fail when power goes out. They don't. They fail when the people who understand them the most are told they're no longer necessary. What Mason didn't understand, what they all failed to see, is that some systems are designed to function without you, but they remember who built them. And if you touch them wrong, if you rewrite memory as if it were just syntax, they won't scream. They'll wait. And then they'll respond. Quietly. Precisely. In the language they were taught. My language. They said it like it meant nothing. 14 words. Read off a piece of paper. With the same tone you'd use to announce a change in cafeteria hours. You are no longer needed within this company, Alexis. That was it. That was the moment. The conference room was quiet. No one else spoke. No HR rep. No legal. Just Mason Griggs, seated at the head of the table, suit pressed, voice level. A single security officer stood by the door. Hands folded. Expression blank. No tension. No escalation. Just precision. It was like watching someone flip a switch, without knowing what it was wired to. I didn't flinch. Didn't blink. But I felt it. The system had heard him. And it remembered. Buried deep inside Lyra's logic, tree beneath redundancies, failsafes, biometric verifications, there lived a dormant protocol. A listening node. A verbal trigger. A clause I had written in a moment of equal parts brilliance and heartbreak. It was never meant to be activated. Not really. It was a last resort. A sentinel. 14 words. Spoken with executive clearance, monitored by the system's passive voice recognition layer, followed by a 90-minute window for one thing. Override. By me. No override, no abort. Just a quiet cascade. Node by node. Region by region. Not to destroy, but to protect. To prevent those who didn't understand the system from using it like a toy. To stop leadership from carving Lyra down to a fragile shell just to chase a market valuation. And now, the words had been spoken. Not by accident, but as a sentence. A dismissal. A signal. They thought they were ending my chapter. They didn't realize they'd just opened the last one. I walked out without a word. Not because I had nothing to say, but because silence, sometimes, is louder than fire. Downstairs, in the lobby, my phone buzzed. Just one notification. Watch layer status, verbal trigger confirmed. Sequence initiated. The message was plain. But to me, it felt like thunder. Singapore. Flagged for sync instability. Frankfurt. Redundant routing loop. San Diego. Delivery queues stalled and debug recursion. I stood there, phone in hand, coat unbuttoned, breath catching behind my ribs. They'd done it. They'd pulled the wrong wire. And now the system was responding not with chaos, but with logic. Not with revenge, but with precision. They thought they were in control. But control, in Lyra, doesn't belong to whoever holds the title. It belongs to whoever understands the design. Have you ever been pushed out of something you built while they pretended you never mattered? Drop a comment below if you've ever watched your name get erased and still knew it couldn't be forgotten. I walked 3 blocks that morning. No destination. Just the sound of traffic and the weight of momentum behind me. The world didn't know yet. Didn't feel the shift. But it would. Not through headlines. Not through sirens. Through the quiet unraveling of a system that had always looked bulletproof. Until someone silenced the only voice that could keep it breathing. They thought they'd fired me. But all they'd done was wake the code. It didn't happen all at once. There was no explosion. No dramatic shutdown. No red screen screaming error across global dashboards. It started, like most real disasters do, with small things. Little flickers. Delays that didn't look like delays. Numbers that didn't quite match. Singapore was first. A logistics delay on a non-critical shipment. Easily ignored. Then Frankfurt. A routing loop began cycling requests through inactive lanes, eating up bandwidth. Still manageable. Then San Diego. Outbound orders began piling in staging queues, waiting for dispatch confirmation that never came. By the time anyone noticed, the queues had quadrupled. Operations thought it was a glitch. They rebooted. Restarted containers. No change. They called it a temporary latency anomaly. I called it what it was. A chain reaction. The trigger had fired. Watch layer was live. And Lyra, faithful as ever, was following its orders line by line. Soft shutdown. Failover. Denials. Prioritized node invalidation. But only the pieces that had been altered. Only the segments that had lost integrity. It wasn't sabotage. It was containment. Like a ship sealing off compartments to stop flooding from sinking the whole thing. And yet, no one in leadership understood that. Not yet. To them, the system was misbehaving. To me, it was protecting itself. By mid-afternoon, the internal Slack channels were on fire. SysOps in Houston asking Frankfurt for code snapshots. Managers in Singapore pinging the global dev chat about resource starvation. Teams spinning in circles, trying to fix something they didn't build and clearly didn't understand. By the time someone thought to look at the rollback logs, it was too late. WatchLayer had already rerouted those too. And buried the breadcrumb trail. I sat in a corner cafe, 3 blocks from headquarters, laptop closed, watching the storm from the outside. Not one alert had been sent to my personal inbox. No one called me. Not yet. But the signs were everywhere. Phones vibrating across tables. Executives walking fast with furrowed brows. The IT guy from floor 12 standing on the curb, pale, eyes glassy, staring at his phone like it had betrayed him. I knew that look. It's the look you wear when the thing you thought was stable, the thing you thought was solid, starts to crack. When you realize the walls don't hold if the foundation is missing. And I had become the missing foundation. They tried to erase me, but they forgot something fundamental. I was the blueprint, the checksum, the validator. The systems didn't need me every day. But when things went wrong, they looked for me. And when they couldn't find me, they locked themselves down. That's how I wrote it. Not out of spite, but out of discipline, out of experience. I'd seen what happened when people with power made decisions without understanding. I wasn't going to let that happen again. So now, while they panicked, I waited. Not with vengeance in my chest, but with a calm they hadn't earned. Because I knew what came next. They would search. They would backpedal. They would beg for clarity. And when they finally reached out, they'd realize it wasn't just the code that was gone. It was the context. And the only person who ever had it was already outside the building. The reports started as numbers, percentages, delays, packet loss, reboots, technical language, clean, contained. But then, they changed. The first message came through an encrypted channel, an old one I hadn't used in years. The subject line read, "Nairobi emergency reroute failed." I clicked. And I felt my heart stop. A shipment of pediatric vaccines bound for 3 rural clinics in central Kenya had been delayed. 26 hours. The temperature controls had failed. Backup protocols hadn't fired. One of the clinics' Kaiera Health Post had to cancel treatment for 10 children. One of them, a 3-year-old girl named Alia, Missed her critical dose window. The email didn't say if she'd survived. It didn't have to. I stared at the screen. Felt the noise of the cafe fade into nothing. This wasn't theoretical anymore. This wasn't about logic trees or failover scripts or executive ego. This was real. This was exactly what I'd built Lyra to prevent. And now it was happening. Because they tampered. Because they optimized. End quote. Because they thought a leaner system was a smarter one. Even if it meant slicing out the parts designed to protect the most vulnerable. The report wasn't from Vanguard's internal system. It was from a former engineer. Someone who had watched the crash happen from the outside. Just like I had. I read every line of the incident log. The sync error that started in Singapore had interrupted bandwidth allocation to Nairobi's outbound queue. That queue had been reserved for emergency temperature-sensitive shipments. But the signal had stalled. No failover activated. No manual escalation. Because those modules had been removed. Deemed non-essential. I pushed the laptop away. My hands were shaking. I wasn't angry. I was ashamed. Ashamed that I'd let it go this far. Ashamed that I thought silence could be a strategy. Because silence doesn't stop collapse. It only delays the scream. I remembered sitting in a cold hospital room 10 years ago, holding Lyra's hand, watching machines beep as if they meant something, while the one thing she needed most sat on a truck, delayed by a system that couldn't see her. I'd sworn that would never happen again. And yet, here I was, watching history rhyme, not in my code, but in what others had done to it. They didn't just rewrite syntax. They unwrote intent. And that's what systems forget. That every decision inside them is connected to a human face. Every logic gate is a moral one. Every failure has weight. In megaptes? Sure. But also in minutes lost. Appointments missed. Treatments too late. Breaths that don't come back. They thought Lyra was a platform. They forgot it was a promise. Now that promise had cracked. And I could feel it deep in my chest. Not as rage, but as responsibility. I couldn't undo what had happened. But I could stop what came next. Not as a rogue engineer. Not as a former employee. But as the architect. The one who remembered what every line of code was meant to protect. And now, I had to decide if I would step back in. Not for control, but for the lives the system still could save. If someone who cared stepped forward. I sat in the dark for a long time. No music. No screens. Just the quiet hum of the city outside my window. And the louder hum of a decision pressing against my chest. Let it burn. That's what part of me said. Let them feel the weight of their arrogance. Let them watch the system collapse, line by line, under the weight of their own shortcuts. It would be easy. I didn't need to do anything. In fact, that was the whole design Watchslayer would run without me. And when it ran out of patience, it would lock them out for good. I could disappear. Start over. Build something new somewhere else. Leave the ruins behind. But then I thought of the girl in Nairobi. Alia. 3 years old. Missed her treatment window because of a sync delay no one knew how to fix. And I thought of the nurse's note at the bottom of the incident report. We almost gave up. Then the trucks arrived, but it was too late for one. That one. Always, there's one. One name that doesn't show up in your metrics. One life that never makes it into the slide deck. One patient, one mother, one child. Lost because someone wanted cleaner numbers. Number. That wasn't why I built Lyra. It wasn't about revenge. It was about prevention. It wasn't about being right. It was about doing what was needed, when it mattered most. I opened my laptop. The interface loaded slowly. Not because of lag, but because I hadn't touched this terminal in weeks. I authenticated. Old credentials, still valid. A system that still recognized its architect. In a secure folder buried in an archive marked. Foundations was the final untouched version of Lyra. Before the pruning. Before the IPO edits. Before Mason, I stared at the file name. Lyra, V-Core, Preopt, Restore. I hovered my cursor over it. And then I did what I hadn't done in weeks. I opened a blank message. Not to the board. Not to the C-suite. But to 10 engineers across 10 different regions. People I had trained, mentored, trusted. People who still knew the heartbeat of the system, even if they'd been pushed to the edges like me. I attached the full restore package, included a short line of instructions. And then, one sentence. No conditions. No contracts. Just fix what they broke. No blame. No demands. Just action. I hit send. And for the first time in weeks, I breathed. Because the choice wasn't between silence and fire. It was between abandonment and responsibility. And I chose the latter. The system had already begun to fracture. But if the right hands took hold, if the right people stepped in, maybe we could still stop the worst of it. Maybe we couldn't save everyone, but maybe we could save the next one. And that was enough for me. I sat back in my chair, watching the file transfer progress across secure nodes. Singapore, Frankfurt, Nairobi, Seattle. Dots blinking green. One by one. They hadn't seen it yet. But help was already moving. The system was no longer listening for a command. It was responding to one. And it was finally listening to the right voices again. The news didn't break with a headline. It started with silence. For 2 days, Vanguard Freight's internal systems spiraled. Nodes went dark. Dashboards failed to load. Dispatch centers scrambled without real-time routing. And then, the media caught on. Widespread logistics disruptions linked to back-end system failure. Millions in medical supplies delayed, company declines to comment. God. Internal memo leaked. We should have never let her go. That last one hit harder than I expected. Not because it vindicated me, but because it revealed how far they'd gone to hide what they didn't understand. I didn't post anything, didn't grant interviews, didn't speak. But the story grew on its own. Former engineers spoke out. Screenshots of internal memos surfaced. One of them, time-stamped 6 weeks earlier, read, "Once we mirror the core logic, we can fully offboard Alexis before the board review." It was clear now. They hadn't just pushed me out. They had planned it methodically, coldly believing they could separate the code from the architect. But systems don't work that way. Not ones built with soul. Meanwhile, the restoration nodes were stabilizing. By the end of the 3rd day, shipments were moving again. Nairobi came back online. Singapore's KO cleared. Frankfurt's cold chain restored its continuity scores. A quiet ripple of normalcy returned. But it was different now. The name Lyra had resurfaced in public channels. Not as a codebase, but as a symbol. A journalist on an independent tech blog wrote, "They didn't just try to replace a system. They tried to replace the conscience behind it." That article was shared over 100,000 times in 2 days. Then came the message I hadn't expected. An internal video surfaced from Vanguard's board meeting. The CEO, Michael Elridge, stood at the head of a long glass table, sleeves rolled, jaw tight. "We underestimated her," he said. "We removed a person who was the infrastructure." He paused. "And now we're paying for that." No excuses. No Daniel. Just the unmistakable tone of a man cornered by reality. He didn't say my name. He didn't have to. Because by now, everyone knew. The comments flooded in. Some were angry. Some were grateful. Many were stunned. And amid the noise, I got one email that stopped me. Short. Plain. It read, "We're building something better. With people who get it this time. Will you join us?" Signed by 3 engineers. All from Nairobi. People who had seen the failure. Not as a technical glitch, but as a human one. I didn't reply right away. I sat with it. Sipped my coffee in a cafe that didn't know my name. Watched trucks outside unload pallets of supplies. wondered where they came from, wondered how many hands had kept that chain alive. And slowly, I felt something shift. Not pride, not victory, but clarity. This wasn't about repairing what had been broken. It was about rebuilding what had been forgotten. Not just systems, but standards, integrity, design with empathy, code with consequences. And somewhere between collapse and clarity, I realized I wasn't done. Not yet. Because if we were going to build a future where systems protected people, we couldn't just write better software. We had to remember why we wrote it in the first place. I never thought the sunrise over Seattle could feel like a beginning again. But that morning, it did. A new office. A quiet one. No glass towers. No reception desks with cold smiles. Just a reclaimed co-working space with mismatched chairs, a whiteboard still stained with someone else's dream, and a coffee pot that hissed louder than it brewed. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was sitting at the beginning of something honest. We didn't call it Lyra anymore. That name would always belong to what was lost, and to what had been saved. This was something different. We named it ARC. Not for architecture, not for Alexis, but for accountable routing core. A system that didn't just move goods. It remembered why those goods mattered. We didn't start with VCs or IPO decks. We started with nurses, with field workers, with engineers who'd been silenced or sidelined for asking the right questions too early. We built it backwards, from the patient, to the clinic, to the air route, to the terminal node. Every layer accountable, every delay explained, every override tied to a real human voice. And yes, there were rules. ARC didn't scale unless it scaled safely. It didn't deploy unless redundancy was documented. And it didn't forget the people who built it. There were no backdoors, only signatures. Each commit stamped not just with a name, but a reason. We printed that policy and pinned it to the wall, right above the door. Anyone who walked in could see it. It read, "Design like someone's life depends on it. Because someday, it will." The Nairobi team came on board first. Then two from Frankfurt. Then a young developer from Texas who had once been laid off for asking too many questions. And, in time, they didn't just build a system. They built trust. We launched quietly. Pilot runs in 5 regions. No fanfare. No press releases. Just lives being protected again. In the background. The way it was meant to be. And then, something unexpected happened. An old competitor reached out. A logistics firm that had once tried to reverse engineer Lyra. They didn't want code this time. They wanted policy. Principles. They'd seen what happened when you build without ethics. They wanted to rebuild the right way. I took the call. And I didn't say yes immediately. But I listened. Because revenge might light the fire. But only legacy keeps it burning the right way. Now, each day feels different. I walk into the office. And I don't brace for erasure. I don't hold my breath waiting for the next decision made without conscience. I see names. Faces. People who understand that every logic path has a heartbeat behind it. And sometimes, in the quiet moments, when the room is still, and the systems hum just right, I imagine Lyra walking beside me. Not in code, but in purpose. Because that's what legacy really is. It's not the product, not the platform. It's the standard you leave behind. And if this story meant something to you, if you've ever fought to protect something worth building, tell us in the comments. What does legacy mean to you? And if you believe systems should serve people, not just profit, share this story with someone who needs to remember that. This isn't the end. It's just the next design phase.